I've been working on the script since back when Three Houses was pretty new to the series, back when the discourse was fresh, and then time passed. I had to go back to school. I started the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster project and started streaming. Like, a lot has happened. And now that Three Hopes has been out for a bit, whatever. The discourse is back. Finally, it is time to really put this game to rights and condemn people for their horny passions. This is what we all wanted, right? Like, people continue to call me an FE2ver, so I really owe it to you all to have my, post-Pixel Remaster video be this beauty. I welcome you all to Fire Emblem, Three Houses, and its incredibly weird failures. It's okay. Just let it happen. It's happening. So, Three Houses, despite the memes about market JPEGs, despite the grotesque clipping issues, despite the recycled animations, all of the visual corners that have been cut, is a weirdly ambitious title. It may not be the slickest presentation in the series, I think Shadows of Valentia still has that title, but it's also a story that is aspiring to be a kind of grand, tragic affair. Let's establish some things right off the bat. Summing the progression of the game up, you, default name Byleth, run into three plucky royal teens, Edelgard, Dimitri, and Claude, and are roped into becoming a professor at their academy in Garreg Monastery, the home to the Central Church of Seiros. You spend the majority of a year there after picking which of the titular three houses to instruct. Things are going well enough, sans a couple of odd actions from the church, a kidnapping, your dad getting murdered, Byleth ascending to godhood until Edelgard decides to declare war on the church, fracturing the academy and thrusting the entire continent into a large-scale conflict. The initial thrust of said conflict at Garreg forces Byleth off a cliff, where they disappear for 5 years only to return to a land divided. The war ravages it, and you have to return to what is left of your former students, build an army, and resolve the conflict, usually ending with a kind of melancholy song about the kind of peaceful life at the monastery that is gone forever now. No matter the progression you choose to get through it, your beliefs, whatever, the game's intent is tragic. Far, far more tragic than arguably any other game in the series. Yes, including Genealogy. I mean, you're given the opportunity to just kill Lawrence and Ash just in case you want to. Look, see, for as tragic as Fire Emblem can be, and it can go pretty dark, these games all more or less conclude by saying the pain that these characters went through, the struggles they endured, were rewarded with a better tomorrow. And while Three Houses is no different on that front, there's a shockingly morose quality to it all. Even Fates, the only other game in the series to do a split path thing, ended their non-golden roots with the survivors of the opposing side of the war reconciling with you, bearing the hatchet, and uniting in peace. Whereas depending on which path you went on, most of the leaders end up dead, with one route heavily implying that they're all dead, leaving Byleth alone to lead the entire continent as the new archbishop. Yay. But that again is the point. Weirdly enough, the emotional thrust of the game really does rest on the idea that no matter your choices, the world is going to progress to a state where the idyllic joys of teaching children how to kill people will all come crumbling down around you. The kind of understated component that, depending on your preferences, ideas, sensibilities, horniness, whatever, the direct cause of it may in fact be a student that you care about. And we will talk about her. We will. But before that, I think it's important to really dig into this. And there's just so much to dig into that it can get really daunting. So for starters, let's just establish why it's important to keep this framing in mind, because I think it can lead into the first weird misstep I think the game committed, which is how the monastery sections function. So in the early stages of the game, you're taught how to navigate the monastery, right? This is a good place to start because it really is the heart of the appeal of the story's first half. Long-running fans of the series may even be particularly charmed if you happen to be, I don't know, some cat girl bitch back in the era of Fates, looking around my castle and thinking, wow, wouldn't it be neat to walk around this place like it was a properly rendered 3D space? Well, congratulations, past me, that's what you've gotten. Charming music plays, people are everywhere, there's all sorts of antics flying about behind them, like a fishing tourney, a ballroom dance competition, Ash coping with the extrajudicial killing of his adoptive father, put a pin in that, it's great. I've witnessed a good deal of complaints about Part 1 and the monastery sections because this one part plays out more or less the same regardless of which house you picked, So having to replay the same things 4 times, or at the very least like 3 times, and like whatever, all of that can feel really bad. But I'm trying to highlight that the first pass through the game will likely have the intended effect, which is to say, charming the pants off the player. Where I think this falls apart is itself emblematic of the kind of design choices and intentions that will crop up in the game the more you look at it. I promise. So, okay, look. The monastery, outside of a charming place to chat with your students and coworkers, provides benefits to the combat and instruction portions of the game, like going to eat food with your students increases their motivation, singing in the choir increases their faith skills, stuff like that. And because this is a mechanical component intended to be used regularly in conjunction with the battles you're going to be participating in, and, the lectures you're going to be giving out, you're put into a position where you and I and God, I guess, all know that the monastery section can't really be done away with, and it isn't. Barring the occasional chapter that skips everything but the big fight, the game will work in that cycle no matter what's happening in the story. This really leads to clumsy moments, like when you take the Bridge of Myrden, only to then, shrug your shoulders and say something about leaving a force behind while you take the heart of your army back to the monastery to eat 10 dinners and grow more pitcher plants to give to Bernadetta. In fact, in the Golden Deer Path, unless I misremembered something horrible, you tell Judith to hold down the fort there, and she shows up. She shows up in the monastery next month anyways. I don't want to get super prescriptive here and say that they should have made it so that you have monastery-like levels more often that aren't the monastery itself, some with missing elements or different kinds of resources tied to the locations you're setting up camp in because you're waging a war, even though I think it would make it better, but the clumsiness of how the monastery is handled from part 1 to part 2 is both an issue that comes up in every path and reveals the kind of conflict this game has between its structural mechanics and its storytelling. You can't completely ditch the monastery in part 2 because the game loop you've established in part 1 needs the monastery to keep working. So no matter what's going on with it, where you are in the war, or even who you've sided with, you always take the monastery, you always have full access to it, and you're fighting a war by basically running back and forth between whatever isolated battlefield you're heading to this month and your home base for some R&R. This issue, funny enough, runs into the second odd thing that happens through each path. So maps. Okay. Look, I think by now we've all just gotten to understand that I will have to talk about mechanics at least a little bit, but I'm not going to get really technical on the map design this time. How effective the layouts are, whatever. Instead, I'm starting where I usually do, and I'm going to talk about the aspirations and the good elements of the map design because I think the intent on it is clear enough. See, let's look back at the last non-remake main series FE title. Let's look at Fates. I can never stop talking about Fates. Fates had a problem. Fates had several problems, but it has a problem with cohesion, specifically, at least with the world at large. It takes a few playthroughs to really feel like you can meaningfully connect all the locations to the map, even with the map laid out for you when you're picking your next battle. This isn't even going into the issues with the back half of Revelations. Having the player feel like they have a meaningful sense of themselves and where they are in the world isn't always a pivotal concern of Fire Emblem, to be fair. A lot of games will have us meander around vague maps while we visit. Wow. While we visit locations. Usually for the first and only time, but Three Houses wanted to go all in on it, so to speak, to the point that they reuse a lot of maps determined by where they are in the world. In theory, this is good, because it does make it feel more coherent, Lake Tutades will always look like that, Sylvain's Place will always look like that, ALL will, etc. and so on, but many fans of the series get annoyed with it because it forces a lot of these maps to be compromised. It forces a lot of these maps to be compromised in how they're constructed, I can speak. Barring very specific special cases like the map underneath the monastery or the Dubstep Thunderdome, you're walking back and forth in these maps a lot, Dragon Age 2 style. So these maps have to accommodate being played multiple times in multiple ways. And for a game built on the premise of strategic tactical role-playing, this can feel lazy, right? And I kind of hate doing this, but here we go. Let's look at Genealogy of the Holy War, the other pretentious FE title to talk about outside of Thracia. So Genealogy had a very specific idea in mind when it came to map design, in that each map could be mapped onto the world map. This sentence sucks, but you get it. Where you're moving your horses around is in line with the big overworld map you look at when each chapter starts. It does mean there are some chapters with overlaps, but all 12, I think, chapters of the game are distinct enough. In contrast, though, the idea Three Houses is going for falls a little short. because the maps themselves are not expansive like genealogies were. So instead, we understand the area around Bridget as this one relatively small feeling fort in the woods. Like the imperial capital Enbar is only ever the specific part of it, same with Fort Mercius and so on. The aspiration of the game was definitely there, but because of the mechanical necessities of it, these aspirations have no choice but to be warped around them. And the critical result here is that their effort to make the game feel, you know, big and cohesive, like a world you're steadily getting to know, ends up flattening. Like, yes, you get to know these locations, but now these locations end up just feeling small. And that, I think, may be enough to start getting into more specific detail. I am sorry. This may very well be a long one. I feel like it's generally a good idea to split a game like this up and talk about each section by itself, and I may still do that, but I think it's important to make some broader divisions first. The game Three Houses has 4 paths. We already know this, and I'm not really going to talk about the Ashen Wolves DLC side story because it's mostly fine. Brief. They reuse a couple of maps. All the stuff I said, blah, 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 blah. I like the new characters, so like whatever. Broadly, these 4 paths are supposed to be distinct narratives through one overarching story. So less Fates-style 3 full-blown games and more one central concept of the game explored in 4 different perspectives, which already makes the game's repetition issue feel a bit worse, but okay. The issue is that of these 4 stories, 2 of them feel more thought out as conflicting opposed narratives, the shortest and longest campaigns respectively, the ones who share a final map song. I'm talking, of course, of Edelgard and Dimitri's paths. They're the ones that I think work best from a narrative structure standpoint. So look, this isn't to say that they're perfect by any means. It's just that the structure of both of these paths make the most sense beat to beat. The critical issue that traces back to Part 1 is that Part 1 has to be Part 1 for every story path. So they have to seed plot lines for everyone, which will necessarily mean that some threads just go nowhere. And under this construction, Crimson Flower and Azure Moon really are the only 2 paths that come out of Part 1 as intact. See, Crimson Flower survives dropping some threads mostly because you rebel against the church, and there you go. Like, you're not going to find out more of the whimsical church intrigue because you're kind of out to destroy it, whereas Azure Moon's path is so often in the spotlight from Part 1 that the few threads it doesn't touch on, namely the stuff with like those who slither in the dark, the kind of like overt villains of the story, don't feel quite so lingering because by and large Dimitri and Edelgard, the house leaders of Blue Lions and Black Eagles respectively, are these huge focal points of the narrative, with each of their paths kind of running through the other figures by and large. Like Claude, Rhea, Thales? Like the bad guys, you get it. Like they'll kind of get wrapped up in these struggles, and they function better as supporting or villain roles, and that's just what they get to be here. So let's get more specific. Let's start with Azure Moon. I think that it's the best written of the paths, and you can quote me on that. And I think it succeeds in part by knowing how to focus on the emotional through line, something that the game struggles with. In other parts, Dimitri, the Crown Prince of Fargus, is here at the Academy to prepare him for taking the throne. During her time as his professor, he talks about his past, how he and Edelgard were childhood friends, she gifted him a dagger before they had to part ways, you know, a bunch of cute stuff, regardless of Felix talking about him as some sort of bloodthirsty killer, like him, the sweet boy with an admittedly pretty bad haircut. Things seem to be going well, barring a weird kidnapping event, until you're sent to Ramire, a village where half the population has gone into a feral, bloodthirsty murder time, and it seems to kind of fracture Dimitri a little bit. Like, it seems like his story is going to be about trauma. Like, the last survivor of this horrific, bloody battle, you know, doesn't respond well to such cruelties. So, like, when your dad dies, and you get revenge and ascend to godhood, Rhea puts you on the Sothis throne, and Edelgard reveals herself as a Flame Emperor, here to declare war on the church. This event finally makes the sweet Dimitri boy snap, and he goes murderous, though, like, you can still make him eat dinner and, like, sing in the choir and shit. It's really funny. By the time you return 5 years later, he's turned himself into a monster. Like, murderous, miserable, fixated on killing Edelgard. You spend a lot of time in Part 2 kind of awkwardly trying to plan around him as he tries to send the army to direct war with the Empire, determined to absolutely kill that bitch. Actually, in particular, it's great because he kind of becomes the logical extreme of what, like, Fire Emblem incidentally is kind of about. Like, we're always fighting these big wars for big justice, and here's Dimitri pointing out that he's doing exactly what he should be, and to find his fury at the Empire distasteful is meaningless because you can't get rid of him. He's a monster, but he's your monster. You wanted this. It isn't until Rodrigue, that's Felix's dad, gets killed saving Dimitri's life that he kind of, like, snaps out of it. This path even does kind of an oddly neat thing in that you get to parlay with Edelgard and try and, like, talk her out of the war. It doesn't go anywhere, but, like, the game really takes a lot of time with building up the kind of tragic relationship Dimitri had with her and how it all went so wrong, even though, and not to drag our boy here or whatever, but his reasoning is, like, the most milquetoast hand-wringing ever conceived. Look, I'm not saying Dimitri is right. It's just that his story has good narrative structure. But for it being the longest version of the game, its effort to make each choice feel grounded and the kind of tension that lies in the heart of this character makes each chapter at least feel coherent. Where there are chapters that feel odd or strained, it more often than not is the result of Dimitri digging you over. Now, glowing praise aside, Azure Moon does, like every path, have its hanging threads. And it is the one that I feel would make the most sense with my little hotfix suggestion from before, because, like, trying to remember that, like, I don't know, there's a section of your army that's essentially agreed to help you with Dimitri while searching for Rhea, who's vanished in the interim 5 years, can feel pretty, I don't know, ancillary. It's not as noticeable as it gets in other paths, to be sure, but it's still kind of, like, hanging over your head here. The other real issue, however, is complicated. So let's talk about Dedue. Okay, so starting off, every house leader in the game has a character that's sort of their, like, particular friend. Like, the character that doesn't join you if you're in other houses. Edelgard has Hubert, Claude has Hilda, sort of, because she can join in almost every other path, and Dimitri has Dedue. So, okay. The tragedy of Duscur was this big retaliation on the part of Fargus, that's Dimitri's kingdom, because the assassination of the king was pinned on them. This led to kind of a genocide, leaving Duscur in ruin with very few people left alive, one of which is Dedue, who Dimitri saved and befriended as a result. Dedue feels like, you know, he owes Dimitri a life debt. This is all well enough. Good drama, some weird commentary on racism, but mostly it makes all sense. So, it makes all sense? It all makes sense, oh my god. So, what's wrong? Well, in part 2, it's revealed that Dedue died to rescue Dimitri from public execution. Initially, this is a pretty good character beat for Dimitri because it really does help paint a better picture of him as this fallen, broken character, but, like, the mechanical elements of this get strained. See, Dedue is a character that you've had the ability to develop since the start of the game, and for them to take him away from you without telling you that you could be making a bad investment would be cruel. So there's a way to ensure his survival. That isn't bad, per se, but reincorporating him into the story poses two more distinct issues. One is that Dedue, as he migrates from a character that is a significant part of the story, as Dimitri's right hand or whatever, to a character that can't have a serious part of the narrative because he may or may not be alive, loses a lot of substance. Like, Gilbert takes over Dedue's position in the narrative in part 2, and he retains that position regardless of whether or not you save Dedue, making it just awkward. Like, this leads seamlessly into problem 2, which is that Dedue's return isn't enough to snap Dimitri out of it. That isn't a problem on the face of it, but what it really means is that Dedue, as used as an element of Dimitri's self-destruction, can't be a refutation of that same despair, which makes the character feel distinctly insubstantial, which sucks because he's a really good character, and we know this because he gets to be a more incorporated element in Dimitri's parts of the stories that aren't Azure Moon. You know, Dedue carries out Dimitri's will in Verdant Wind and Silver Snow, and he martyrs himself in Crimson Flower, and these these beats all work way better than the actual route you get to actually spend the most time with him, and that's bizarrely frustrating. Look, it's understandable that a game featuring this many characters cannot hope to preserve their narratives all the way through, especially when the potential for any of them to die forever looms over their heads. But to have a character that the game makes an effort to involve in the story directly get kind of cross-faded out feels really unsatisfying. And this would be the time to talk about the other much more unsatisfying path in the game, but I'm holding that one for last because it is my favorite. So let's talk about the others. So, I know I'm coming into this chapter already a bit dismissive of the other two paths, Silver Snow and Golden Wind, and I have already put myself in what feels like a war of attrition and trying to remind the FE fandom that there are good things about Three Houses in particular and Fire Emblem as a whole, so let's start with the positives. I think that at its heart, Verdant Wind feels the most like a classical Fire Emblem narrative. It doesn't have the kind of reclaiming your home country energy that Azure Moon does, but it situates Edelgard in the typical role of the face character for your opposition, whose defeat reveals the real villains behind it all. Taken broad, I will argue that this fits really nicely with the kind of characterization that Claude has as someone who's trying to assess all elements involved in the conflict before making decisive action. It is also the path with a killer final map song. More on that later. And for Silver Snow... well, okay, so, look, it's my least favorite path, but I think it's interesting in that it is definitely one of the hardest paths you can take because you're out of a lot of firepower in that you have no house leader character in your army. Catherine, who functions in Azure Moon and Verdant Wind as your early game Jagan, is sort of caretaker character for your army, while, like, it's mostly underpowered. Sort of. She has one of the strongest swords in the game in the moment you recruit her, and she doesn't join your army in this path until right before Part 2, in addition to Cyril, a character who's designed to be a growth unit, someone who starts off underleveled and weak, but has excellent growths and the potential to get really strong. Making his recruitment right before Part 2 just much harder to deal with. Additionally, the final boss in this path is also extremely difficult. Plus, it gives you all of the tricky recruitment options. Hilda, for example, can be recruited in this path, but you only have about 2 weeks in game to do it, and you can't give her gifts beforehand like with everyone else. Also, where Lawrence leaves and needs to be re-recruited in Azure Moon, and Ash does the same in Verdant Wind, Lawrence and Ash both leave in Silver Snow, so the game really has fun being mechanically kind of mean to you throughout. And if you like that sort of thing, then you're in luck. Now, what's wrong about these paths? Well, on the surface, not much, like mostly because they're almost identical. They both have more or less the exact same chapter progression, with Silver Snow missing out on the Gronder field battle because they couldn't put you on the map made for 3 armies to clash, and having a different final boss than Verdant Wind. Like, they're beat for beat the same. And this point is tricky because if we really want to peel back the veil here, Azure Moon also overlaps a lot in the early parts of Part 2, and again, everyone's Part 1 is basically the same, so repetition and overlap shouldn't be such a big deal as long as the story you're telling is different, right? Like, they sort of are. I mean, obviously in that there are slight differences in chapters, but also, like, the perspective, or at least the conversations that happen in between battles tend to be a bit different. The major issue here is that how and when they diverge feels forced. I'm about to go into more specific detail here, but for now it's important to see where actions in the story are motivated and move from character-driven conflicts like in Azure Moon versus what happens in Verdant Wind or Silver Snow, where something inexplicable happens and, like, we just have to drop everything and kill Nemesis or Rhea respectively. It is already a weird thing to do to kind of drop the final battle onto you out of the blue, but as we're about to get into, it just gets weirder the more you look at it. So here's the thing. Three Houses started us all off with pretty broad characterizing of our 3 main characters that aren't us. Edelgard is kind of unflinching and proper, Dimitri is kind and sweet, and Claude is friendly, but a schemer. Like, this is fine, a lot of things do that. It's good to get a broad sense of your cast and let them develop and grow the more you get into their story. Like, that's good shit. But where that struggles largely is by how they go about Claude's characterization specifically. Now, a lot has been made of the expression, show, don't tell, and I'm of the opinion that it's irresponsible to be dogmatic about anything in the process of storytelling. But in this situation, there's just a lot of tell going on for very little show of it. Like it's not bad on paper to have someone tell you that this character is a schemer, right? Like, it's a little bit of an interesting thing to open with. And honestly, as the story progressed, I was kind of expecting that the idea of Claude being a schemer was kind of like an unfair opinion held of him because of, well, probably racism. Like, I mean, you've all read the Hilda and Cyril support conversations, right? You know what I'm talking about, but it sort of lingers on him loosely. He jokes about it, calls himself a planner, makes some interesting comments about poison at one point. It's a part of his character that just doesn't really come to fruition until I believe there are two moments when Claude makes a big scheme. So the first was setting up a fire trap for when the Empire tries to invade the monastery, and the second was the whole dressing up and impersonating enemy soldiers thing he does to sneak into Fort Mercius. Now, here we are with some genuine schemes, and that would be great, everything I wanted, but these are also things that everyone else comes up with in Azure Moon and Silver Snow, so playing through every route, the thing that the game wants you to do, since no one path tells you the full story, undermine Claude's characterization in a big way. I will say that the only meaningful distinction he brings to this setup would be the Fort Mercius thing, where he brings the Elmiran army as reinforcements. Like, that part is pretty good, but it's basically the only part of Verdant Wind that stands out when you play this map 3 times by now. On top of all of this, it just gets worse from here. So let's go back to part 1 for a second. So I've been dancing around the one path that's pretty different from the others and what that path hinges on, but Claude spends a lot of time in part 1 sneaking around the monastery, finding things out about the church, kind of positioning himself in ways to really pry into what they're clearly hiding, and that is also, frustratingly, the kind of things you really need for Claude's character to make sense. And it makes it all the more frustrating when all of this gets dropped because Claude has to fight Edelgard in part 2, like in Silver Snow and Azure Moon. And it's not like it's unreasonable for someone like Claude to be in a situation where he needs to fight Edelgard, but the Three Houses' critical flaw really does seem to be that the story and the mechanics really struggle to come together because Claude slots into the role that happens in the other 2 relevant paths kind of out of mechanical obligation. These are the kind of choices that really make the game frustrating because you can see distinctly the idea, like the concept of where these characters could be going, and then it just doesn't come together. Worse yet are the moments in the story where Claude literally voices his own idea of how he'd go about dealing with a particular issue, only to, let the plot of the story happen anyway, because I don't know. We go out to the Sealed Forest to get dad revenge, like in every path, but here's Claude going, well, we're not out for revenge. We're just gonna scout the place and figure out what they're doing, and we fight them anyway, because, you have a child goddess, a barefoot child goddess to absorb into your body. Take it up with intelligent systems, I guess. One last thing on our Golden Boy here. So, where the paths diverge, just on the concept of our respective final bosses, make an interesting offer. So, both paths take you through the Agarthans, that's the bad guys' secret hideout, where you finish, and when you finish the map, they drop a tactical missile on you, like one that Rhea takes to the face. In one path, the resulting explosion, activates something in the hideout, and Nemesis, the ancient king, the guy at the start of the game fighting Rhea, rises from the dead, and you have to kill him. In the other, that doesn't happen, but Rhea, goes mad from tactical missile-related injuries, and then you have to put her down like it's season 8 of Game of Thrones. Now, I don't really think that the Rhea boss is a great concept, mostly because she's the final boss of Crimson Flower, and it feels awkward to reuse it, but it makes a modicum of sense that this would be one of those secrets that Claude could have, unearthed some kind of information to lead to the conclusion that the way she's been hit, or something about how her blood works, or something could lead to this nightmare situation. And on the other side of things, a story that's centered primarily around Byleth's destiny, rising to godhood and becoming the next Rhea, the next Archbishop of the Church. All of that does kind of makes sense when the final conclusion lies in Byleth taking Rhea's metaphorical place on a grand battle against her ancient foe, becoming and rising above her as the new star of Fodlan. But that's not how that works. Claude's destiny is fighting Nemesis, and Byleth's final act ascending them to Archbishophood is killing the former Archbishop. Jesus, I can't speak. Or marrying her, I guess. So I know I'm back in fanfiction prescriptive, wow, the game should have done this territory and I need to stop, but I don't think either of these battles would feel quite as abrupt as they do if they swapped positions. As they are now, these endings feel jarring because they don't follow up on the threads laid out in the events building up to them. Claude wasn't worried about Nemesis as much as he was focusing on these big plans to create peace between Fodlan and Elmira, both his home countries, while Byleth, Seteth, and Flayn were busy digging around in Rhea's past. I don't know, it just comes off as artificial, and okay. Okay, I hate to do this because talking a lot about music makes me nervous because I worry that music theory Twitter will find out that I'm a colossal idiot and I'll feel infinite shame. But let's look at God Shattering Star. First off, great song. Nothing against the song. It's epic, sweeping, powerful, exactly the kind of thing that like fits the fighting nemesis thing. Like I'm on board. I'm on board. Secondly off, the game focuses a lot on leitmotifs, familiar melodies that linger and haunt the halls of the monastery everywhere, which culminate really delightfully in the battle songs in both Crimson Flower and Azure Moon. God Shattering Star, I mean, it kind of works in that it feels disconnected from everything, just like the fight is, but it bothers me all the same because highlighting how strange it is that this is where the path ends, no matter how epic the fight or song is, no matter how apt it is that a lot of monastery dialogue goes on about how exhausted everyone is and how upsetting it is that we have to keep on fighting after what felt like 2 previous climactic final battles. It is just not an engaging kind of fatigue. Like, not to beat a dead Rodrigue or whatever. Is that something? Azure Moon is the same number of chapters as Verdant Experience Requiem, but it feels shorter because there's a lot of well-conceived motivation backing up how that story progresses. You spend a significant chunk of Part 2 acquiescing to Dimitri's mad murder path to Edelgard until Rodrigue dies for him, forcing him to finally make wiser choices, turn the army around, and reclaim his homeland before going back to finish the job in the Empire. Here, and by association also in Silver Snow, you and Claude make a beeline to Edelgard, kill her a couple of chapters before the end, where Hubert reveals the identity of the Agarthans and their HQ posthumously, where you head on out to that final encounter against the people at the heart of all the misery, only to then incidentally witness the rise of their ancient king, and where each step makes sense, the character's engagement with these steps is passive, where these reveals are given to us kind of abruptly, and we just spend the last few chapters of the game kind of awkwardly shifting focus to these new threats. Now, before I move on to the final path, I also want to make a final point on Silver Snow. So, in following each other's footsteps, you also kill Edelgard a few chapters before, and the sequence plays out beat for beat like it does with Claude. This is awkward in a couple of ways, so taking it from the top of Part 2 here. Each path, except for Crimson Flower, opens with a fully animated cutscene, with Byleth reuniting with your former house leader. Claude is bathed in light, happy to see you again. Dimitri is shrouded in darkness, too damaged to take your hand. And in Silver Snow, you meet Edelgard in the light of the moon, where you cross blades. You don't start by crossing blades, you start by talking, by her being happy to see you again, by her being crestfallen that you have to fight each other. And this is some good shit, and it sets up the story, like, nicely. Edelgard was your student in this path, after all. And there's a lot of dialogue choices you can make as Byleth that expresses remorse or regret about the position you're in. You can choose to admit that you don't want to kill her. Like, it's what makes the animated cutscene when you do kill her feel pretty significantly tragic, but it's a strained execution. Like, Edelgard, more than anything else in this path, really does feel positioned to be the pivotal figure in Silver Snow, at least from, like, an antagonist role, since Rhea would be, like, the other important figure since you sided with her and all. But like, then the position in the story where you kill Edelgard feels off because she's dispatched in the same place Claude's story dispatches her, a placement that works for his story since she's not the pivotal antagonist in Claude's narrative. He has larger, broader aspirations, but the cutscene's tragedy is undermined in Claude since you were never Edelgard's teacher in this path. Like, this really lies at the heart of the struggle I have with these paths being so close together. Like, they necessarily have to compromise for each other's sake. And just like with the map design, trying to fit the same progression into 2 theoretically distinct narratives shortchanges everything in the process. And this is also why Rhea as the final boss of Silver Snow feels so off, because it really just comes out of nowhere, and to shelve your more compelling antagonist early to make you have to abruptly kill Pope Mommy, like that sucks. So with that all out of the way, let's finally get into it. That's right, everyone. Like, we're taking a breath, grab some water, get a fruit snack or whatever, because it's time for Edelgard Discourse. There is one path in the entire game that meaningfully picks up from, like, on the odd lingering threads that show up in Part 1. See, like, Early on, the church discovers that there are some folks that may be planning a mutiny. That's Lord Leonardo, Ash's adoptive father person, who's collaborating with the Western Church, which develops animosity with Rhea's leadership. In response to this, Rhea sends you out to kill Leonardo and his militia, a thing you can force Ash to participate in. When later on you confront and capture members of the Western Church, Rhea has them all executed on the spot for being heretics. This isn't even getting into Rhea's weird thing with Byleth, so let's just briefly get into that too. See, funny enough, there's sort of a reason why Byleth is stone-faced, head empty, and that's that Byleth was a baby that wasn't going to survive the birth, and neither was their mother Citri, who insisted that Rhea put Sothis' crest stone into Byleth's heart to at least save the child, killing Citri in the process. This worked out, which is why Sothis lives very literally rent-free in your head, but it also makes Byleth kind of odd. Like, you don't have a heartbeat, and Byleth rarely, if ever, emotes meaningfully. Now, as an aside, I feel like Byleth is another odd issue in the game, but I'll get to that in a moment. This all happened because Rhea has been running experiments in secret to try and bring her mother Sothis back to life. The church is up to some weird shit, and the closest any path really gets to addressing that is the Claude stuff they drop later on that I told you about. However, if you fulfill all the requirements to unlock the Crimson Flower path, you can actually side with Edelgard against Rhea. So, okay, I feel like some of you who might have seen this might have noticed that I've made some kind of spurious claims like how the game seemingly forces you to stay in the monastery even when it doesn't make sense to you, or how it would be weird and kind of sadistic for the game to give you a character and then take them away from you abruptly, like if there was no option to save Dedue and Blue Lions, or how they keep you from recruiting Cyril or Catherine until they know you're playing a normal route. Maybe, just maybe, some of you out there pause the video to comment about how I clearly don't know what I'm talking about, but that's my Claude-like scheme, and you walked right into it, you impatient freaks. I'm sorry. See, all these forced mechanical restrictions in Three Houses are made all the more frustrating because Crimson Flower actually does break from these restrictions sometimes. After the chapter where you side with Edelgard, you can't stay in the monastery anymore because of treason, and you're instead moving to a temporary war camp with everyone you could bring with you. The game punishes you, denying you the extra time to build and prepare your army like you had in the other routes. It actually punishes you twice, because in order to unlock the Crimson Flower route, you have to have gone with 80 to a coronation, which skips a bunch of time in the month preceding. Wow. The game also removes Flayn from your party after having her around for a few months by now, to the point where you could have made her your dancer. Fun fact, did you know that you can choose who among your students gets to be your dancer? The dancer is a unique class where they can dance for a unit that's already made a move that turn, and then they can move again. Wow, hope you didn't turn Flayn into one before setting against the church, or in the case of Silver Snow, the one path where almost everything that can be mechanically mean to you happens. I hope you didn't turn 80 or Hubert into one, because same fucking problem. The game, turns out, is actually capable of messing with you. You're put into this little holding place in order to prepare what little you can for an all-out war against the church that took you in, working alongside the Agarthans in a limited capacity of all things. Very conquest. Now, here's a lot of things. Like a lot of things are here to unpack all at once, and you're all stuck with me until you turn the video off, so okay. So let's start with the weird gameplay stuff. So the fact that the game actually does break its own rules is on paper good. I like it when a game sets up an expectation of how things go and then pulls the rug out from under you. It's cheeky, it's fun, that's fun design. I wish they did it more, or failing that, they were more interested in how it's executed, because here, in this example, we run into an issue. Flayn joins you automatically after the chapter where she's kidnapped and you have to rescue her. That's fine and dandy, but then she leaves when you turn against the church. In contrast, we have Hilda, someone who is hard-coded out of joining your class until you don't make a decision that you would otherwise not really make in any other circumstance. The mechanics going into this decision are wild and fascinating, because I have to assume the reason they don't let you recruit her into the Black Eagle houses, because in the event you're playing Crimson Flower, Hilda's character wouldn't move to an army that's going to fight Claude. She's too loyal, though I guess not loyal enough to stick around with him if like you're doing Silver Snow or Blue Lions. Look, this is fine, but it is also a baffling decision when they have another character that joins and then leaves. They'd presumably even leave in the same time as each other, so you could reasonably conceive of being able to recruit Catherine, Cyril, Flayn, and Hilda like in every other path, only to have them ditch you when you defect, and that could be fun to play with, because you're not conspicuously tipping your hand that something may be funky about this path in particular. Instead, you play the Black Eagles either as your first route, where you mindlessly assume that Hilda's just like Dedue, and that Cyril and Catherine are either later recruits or non-recruitable characters, like Seteth seems to be, only to dip into other paths and see that they can all join you pretty readily. Or you played one of the other houses first, and then Cyril, Catherine, and Hilda, assuming you did Blue Lions, becomes an ominous red flag that something funky's gonna go down this path. It's a very weird construction to have. Going a little deeper, you start to see the other mechanical oddities in Crimson Flower. I've already said that it's the shortest path by far, but beyond that, most big events that play out in full cutscenes in literally every other path are done with stills instead, save the conclusion of the final chapter. This is really where the arguments for this game being rushed, or at least like this path getting rushed, start to really take purchase, because this rushing does two very strange things to this path. Firstly, and most superficially, this path becomes the less aesthetically pleasant one, because nothing feels quite as important using the visual language of the game, and that feels even worse considering that this is not only the only path where you get to have Edelgard on your side and get to see the war from her perspective, but there's a lot of emotionally raw moments in it that feel undercut by the more slapdash presentation. I mean, there's an entire parallel situation going on with Dimitri kneeling before Edelgard before she kills him, a scene that was fully animated when Dimitri kills her in Azure Moon, and you kill her everywhere else, that just doesn't get to have the same kind of framing. Boo. The second part of this... Okay. So all of these components that make this path feel rushed aren't just aesthetic, since there are significantly less chapters in Crimson Flower, but a lot of weird issues that need to be addressed, like her working for the Garthans, the comically overstated bad guys that killed your dad, like them destroying Arianrod after you take it out of, like, spite for you guys going against them. Like, these need to be addressed, but they're addressed really quickly and in ways that are really interesting. I'll get to that soon. I know I'm hesitating. It's called building tension. What this does ultimately is undermine the kind of narrative trust you can have in Edelgard, and this, finally, is my hot take. I think what makes this one character, maybe, arguably, more than literally every other character in the entire series, this divisive, is that she stands in a position narratively, thematically, emotionally, where you're being asked to read a lot into her motivations, her decisions, and because all of these elements, like, there just really isn't a clear answer, as much as an answer that will inevitably reveal things about you the more you interrogate it. What you fixate on, what you like, what you don't like. Because she's in such a nebulous place in the game, you have to bring a lot to the table in order to really say something about her. So, let's say something about her. So I like to put my own opinions on polarizing things aside in most things, because it's annoying when people just call me biased and ignore everything else I say, especially when I'm trying to be like open-minded to differing interpretations and stuff like that. I don't like using my incredibly tiny platform to bully people. So why do people hate Edelgard? And I don't just mean that they aren't a fan of her character or anything mild like that. I mean people calling her a fascist and getting offended that people like her levels of hatred. Well, the simple answer, or at least a simple answer, could just be that she is the villain in most other routes. Like, she wears scary red armor with devil horns. Hubert's characterization for most of the game has been, well, one of his lost items you can find for him is a rag soaked in ether, so, I don't know, you tell me. There's a lot of, broad, emotional, visual information that really unambiguously situates her at the bad guy table. Now, this isn't to say that everyone who hates her has been tricked by the shiny veneer of evil, and I mean the people who like 80 are some kind of, enlightened super people. I'm actually not. There's a lot more to it than just being lured in by compelling visual design, because understanding her identity not just as the bad guy, but as the antagonistic, But as the antagonistic Flame Emperor, who's been showing up doing bad stuff for most of Part 1, puts a really heavy context on her, one that, as we've discussed already, the game is kind of bad at meaningfully digging into. I'm not going to get too far into it, though, fine. It is weird that she hires bandits to attack her, Claude, and Dimitri. It is weird that her and the Death Knight seem to have an ambiguous alliance, and then she foils his plan to kidnap Flame. It is weird that a lot of what the Flame Emperor does in the game seems to not make sense when you understand the Flame Emperor as Edelgard. But my sticking point interactions is really just going to come a bit later, I'm sorry. So, okay. To recap what I said, because this essay is a cavernous nightmare, there is a lot of stuff that goes down in Part 1 that really paints the church in a very rough light. The church is up to some bullshit, and that provides an excellent base for 80's arguments against it. One that she does make, but her character whiffs really badly on a lot of pivotal moments, and I don't think that it's a mistake on the part of her writing, as much as needing to make the choice to side with her or not feel meaningful. That she speaks so roughly to you following your dad's death is both revealing of her past traumas and enough to really feel like maybe she's using you, or at least sees you as more of an instrument in her goals, rather than someone who suffered a great loss. It kind of depends on your interpretation to some extent. Moreover, when given the choice to side with her chance to convince you, that exchange is really rushed. She kind of just insists that you please trust her, and you presumably go along with it thinking that she's going to explain that to you, and she kind of just doesn't. Spend that time in your temporary base camp with her, gently insisting that things will work out. These choices keep happening too, from Hubert and her insisting that we lie to our companions about the destruction of Aryan Road, to steal our resolve for the final push, to them telling you that your alliance with the Agarthans is unsteady but necessary, and that their next step after finishing the war is to get rid of them, can feel like an ever-expanding series of worrying lies, so much so that the Edelgard as a fascist camp often looks at these parts of the story to construct the idea that she's manipulating you, has been this whole time, and will continue to do so, and I can see how they get there. If you go into this already not trusting Edelgard, all of this feels like she could be lying to you. On the other hand, and to spoil the reveal, this is where I'm coming from in all of this, if you trust her, these all feel like extremely unpleasant decisions that she's had to make. If, like me, you caught on to the abuses of the church really early, and they have stuck in your brain the entire time you've been playing, and after going through every route, you find that none of them, save this one, gets to actually address that, not even the one that came frustratingly close, this route feels almost revelatory, like you've banded together the only people in the land who can see the deep structural faults in Fodlan, and have committed to undoing its unjust hierarchies and its theocratic control over the people. And if that means that ugly choices have to be made, then so be it. That is Edelgard's worldview in a nutshell. Our world is rotten with unjust hierarchical power, people tortured, abused, and abandoned over this immoral crest system, and even if it shatters the tenuous peace, she will take radical action to leave the world better than she found it. That is a lot to deal with. A lot for a fucking Nintendo title to try and shoulder. And the real struggle I have with it is that Three Houses is a frustrating text to unpack, because it's evident that it didn't really pull off a swing like this, but why? Why do we all know that they couldn't get this, but there's so much disagreement on, why they couldn't? I don't want this to come off like I'm trying to start a feud, but there's a long video out there by Farkast on Edelgard, which is pretty good, but there's a point in there that I don't want to disagree with, but I want to explore it. He makes this point about how in Crimson Flower, the path through the game to really get to see Edelgard at her best, she's still deceiving the other students, still lying to them about her uncle, about who destroyed Arianrod. All of this happens with no comeuppance. Her comrades, her allies, are ignorant of this truth for the rest of the game, and she gets away with it. And Fargus takes this as a deep failing of the game, that her actions should have more meaningful consequences, or else it shows that her rapport with them has never really grown. I want to ask, though, what does it say about her if we take this action as intended? What if this is the story the writers want to tell about her, as someone who's willing to turn herself into a monster to try and make the world a better place to live? What does it say about your beliefs if this action confirms her inner villainy to you instead of being kind of the ultimate sacrifice she has to make? The issue is that there is no one singular failing done in the course of this game that directly confirms what went wrong with Crimson Flower as much as it is the result of all the decisions made about this path coming together. It is likely the most rushed, so you have less time with Edelgard on the route that is supposed to be her story. Because there's less time, they have to prioritize certain elements of the narrative over providing a richer picture. This leads to the character having less time to explore the results and consequences of her actions in a way that's meaningful and tangible for the player to engage with more directly. So a lot starts to just bank on whether or not you trust this character, and that trust can be really insufficiently fostered because of the original decision to make the Black Eagle's path split, which means that this is the only path that the player gets real agency on. This results in making either option at least have some grounding in it, which means that what little time we do have with Edelgard has to be split between supporting her and incriminating her to make that one important choice actually feel meaningful. And here we are. This is all, of course, assuming the people who are criticizing the character are doing so after playing her route and not just playing through one of the others and assuming that she's just evil and not bothering to play Crimson Flower, which surely no one would do, right? All of this, everything we've discussed in this horrible video is why the game frustrates me. If we look at games with, like, flimsier constructions, even games in the same series like Awakening or Fates, it's easier to just find the things you like about them and lean into that. The story is goofy, the characters are shallow, but I do like building big, imposing characters and matchmaking, so it's kind of just easier to shrug through the kind of flimsy story because those titles don't really have narratives that are aspiring to complex looks into why people do bad things. But when we run into games like Final Fantasy VII Remake or Persona 5 or Three Houses, the aspiration, the feeling of these stories really grasping at something, shooting for a more ambitious goal and missing, that can be intensely frustrating. Look, I love playing Three Houses, maybe more than the other two games I've done essays like this on, but Crimson Flower bothers me more than any run of Conquest I've ever done because it feels like it really tried to be something deeper than horny anime chess and more than just having a chip on my shoulder because I'm increasingly frustrated in how we talk about media depictions of fascism as though fascist is just a shorthand for any bad person in charge of an army instead of a specific term with a distinct meaning. I worry that I've spent all this time for no reason. Like, no matter what I say, or really any FE-tuber, video essayist, anyone says, it's easy to try to speak earnestly about art you like, even if the art you want to talk about is made by a heartless corporation, and just receive nothing but a cold dismissal of your view because, you know, Edelgard sure does wear red armor. Like, it's hard to try and engage with something like this game when so much of the fan culture around it feels already set in stone. Even now, even with Three Hopes discourse presumably happening somewhere out there, like, it feels like the fandom doesn't want to relitigate any of this. The list of approved talking points for Three Houses, the maps being bad, Ingrid being the token racist, which is wild because Hilda's right there, Edelgard being the bad guy, the one meme about the person accusing Dimitri of not just killing but murdering women, like, the discourse is already done. And that sucks because this game could be looked at more as a guide for where the next title in the series could go, what we could learn about how these stories are made, and maybe as a cautionary tale to stop having self-inserts as the main character for your dialogue-heavy strategy game. Special thanks to Brandon Haney, Caitlin Fisher, Colleen T., Dector A., the School of the Americas Alumni Legal Defense Fund, Lewis Wells, Lores, Maria Aladren, Alistair V., Natalie Lane Baker, Narai the Redmarked, Pahor, Professor Bopper, St. Rawberry, Thomas Wulpez, and Zetetic. Thank you all so much.